Once upon a time, in the land of Kankalan, there lived a distinct group of people that worked very hard. They were part of a very wealthy empire, but they found that the more wealthy the empire became, the poorer their sect became. Things were just not affordable for regular people. So they decided to head out to see if they could find other parts of wilderness that were not ruled by any monarchy. The catch is that they had to find areas that were basically uninhabited. Of course, they were still lands and territories said to belong to the monarchs, but no one could ever live there, so it's not like they sent anyone out there to go and watch these places, to guard them and ensure that people were doing what they were supposed to do. A bunch of homeless people live there, and it's not like they could get very far anyway, because the further into the desert, they had to cross the desert to get anywhere, and the further into the desert these people would travel is the higher the chance that they would end up dead. And indeed, these groups of travelers did dwindle as time went on. All they had was a clothes on their back and a few select belongings, things that they could carry in a knapsack or on their person, and it was very hard. One day, one of the travelers had sat down, and a bunch of them were dying off. There were not many people left, and he said to the others, look, we need to rest. It's very cool here. Maybe we can set up camp here. And they said this is the worst time to do that, because if we do that, then what will happen is the sun will rise high in the sky again, and we'll all get burnt up. We're all on our last leg here. We should just keep going until we get to the plateaus. The man said, look, this is the coolest part of our journey. I just have a feeling. And others didn't listen to him. They went on, but he and a select few people did decide to stay. The others that had gone on, unfortunately, did end up perishing. The man, as they would have it, they went to go set up their camp by a bunch of rocks, and they found that when they were moving the rocks around to help set up their camp, there was some water. The ground was very wet, and so they dug underneath those rocks, and there was a stream flowing directly from underground. There was nothing leading to it. It just literally seemed like a fountain that was just oozing out water, fresh, cold water. And he told the other people what happened, and they were just so happy and overjoyed that they decided to stay with this guy. Among those people were the Gervais, Mr. Gervais and Mrs. Gervais. The both of them had gotten to talking to each other some time ago. As a matter of fact, they got married in the middle of their journey. And over time, the Gervais family set up their roots here. They built crops and just agriculture, huts, and they did all their inventions here, but they still wanted to stay under the radar of the monarchs. The couple was very happy, and after a while, they realized that they were quite prosperous. They had a little business for themselves where people would go to them for their crops and output, and the father was very good at building things. Soon they terraformed the land, and they dug out channels until the fountain became more abundant and created a stream through their little area, and then plants started to grow up, and over time they realized that the land was becoming more prolific. It was becoming more inviting. It took a lot of work and invention for them to do this. The Gervais eventually had died off, but they did leave behind a son. His name was Volker, and just like his father was an inventor, Volker basically took over from his father when it came to inventing things and just learning about their environment. He became the go-to when people would ask, hey, how do we plant this? Hey, there's a rock here. We want to spread out, but the rocks are impeding the roots of some of our crops. What do we do? And he basically could answer a lot of their questions. Volker was very, very prideful. And when he saw that over time, the vegetation became more widespread, their town was just becoming richer, he became a little full of himself and wanted to push people even harder. People would say, Volker knows what he's doing. Train your children under him. And so people would send their sons under Volker to learn some of his trade. Of course, he wouldn't tell them everything, but there was one person named Yancey who was very, very beautiful. And her brother was actually one of the students under Volker. Her brother loved animals, and there were lots of animals around, but they were just smaller animals. They were like desert animals, and after they started kind of terraforming the area, a greater variety of species started showing up in their area, and they decided to name their area the Valley of Hugran. After after a while, word did go out about the Valley of Hugran. Monarchs surely were going to know about this place sooner or later. Volker Gervais was basically telling people that, you know, we're gonna want to start making defenses and weaponry soon. And some of the people of the town were a little bit ambivalent about that, because that was kind of how the entire realm of the monarchs had started to become corrupt, where people were starting to start wars with other people and using the weapons to control the people. People just worried that it would turn into the same thing. But Volker basically told them, look, they're going to find out about our town sooner enough. And you think the monarchs are going to be happy about us getting away from paying taxes to the empire so that we could have our own little town and live free off of what is technically their land, even though it was uninhabited? He said, realistically, we're going to have to find a way to defend ourselves. And even still, once the initial scouts come over here, we might be able to defend ourselves against them, but we're still talking about us versus an entire empire. So the people were just like, look, if we start building defenses and all these weapons, then they're surely going to see that we're a threat. And as a result, because Volker had become kind of the head of the town, people kind of felt weird. Now they had their children, they had their grandchildren, they had their farms, and they were worried that the anger and wrath of the empire was going to come down their head. So half of the village decided to just up and leave. They figured if they just kept bouncing around in different lands, then it would be harder for the monarchs to find them. But Volker was determined, and he wanted to stay. Among the people who stayed behind, Matt Uldis and his sister Janse Uldis decided to stay as well. Janse and her brother were always fighting with each other. Her brother, as I said before, loved animals, and he loved working under Volker. And he would always go to Volker ever since he was younger, and he was like, dude, guess what? I found this like crazy animal. Oh my gosh, it looks so freaking amazing. You have to come and see it. Volker just thought he was very annoying, but he was like, all right, fine. What is it? Because this particular time, Matt just seemed very adamant about this specific animal that he found. So he said, I can't bring it to you. You just have to come and see it. It's caught right now, but you have to come and see it. And apparently Matt had set up one of the traps and had gone out there, and this thing that he didn't even intend on catching, he caught. The thing that the creature was trying to hunt was what Matt was trying to catch, because he would catch little rodents to basically use them as food as well, but also as fertilizer. So Volker was annoyed. He's like, all right, fine. What is this creature? And Janse decided to go with them, because by this time she had started to become closer with Volker as a result of her brother becoming closer with him. And she really admired the older man. When Volker saw what Matt was talking about, he was honestly very shocked. In the trap was this strange creature he's never seen before. And it looked like a mixture between a canine and a bat. It was just very odd. The creature was as small as a cat. Its head was much larger though, and it was snarling at them. It looked very scared, and under its paw was some rodent, the thing that Matt was actually trying to catch, and it just had gotten its foot stuck in the trap and was snarling at them. So of course, Volker was like, you know what, that's kind of interesting. I've never seen a creature like this before. I didn't even know something like this existed. And it turns out, after much experimenting, that Volker would realize that, wow, this whole desert area that was basically undiscovered or unexplored because it was technically the monarch's land had a slew of animals in it that had been just evolving separate from mankind, just in their own little way. They were just evolving on their own very rapidly in a hostile environment. And so this made Volker very interested in just researching animals as well as ways to invent things. He was wondering how to implement that. Volker decided, he was like, you know what? Good job, Matt. Matt was very happy about this, and he decided to work under Volker full time. After a while, Janse, of course, became familiar with Volker. She would sleep with him, and he pretty much ignored her afterwards because it wasn't about that. It was fun for him, you know, sleeping with this girl who was always following him around like a puppy because she admired him, and she probably admired him because he was now basically the leader of town. He invented, she loved his mind, and he was pretty handsome for an old guy, so she did what she had to do. Unfortunately, one of their escapades led to her getting pregnant. When Matt found out about it, he was very, very angry, but he wasn't angry with Volker, he was angry with her, saying, how could you ruin a perfectly good relationship? And Janse was very upset because in her mind, it's like, dude, it's not about you. But anyway, Volker and Yancey would have their child, and it would be a little baby girl named Skyla. From a very early age, as a toddler, Skyla loved animals, and her parents could see that about her. As Skyla grew, as much as Volker was kind of mad about having to become a father, he wasn't prepared for that. He actually got closer with his little girl, and he started to teach her what he was doing. When she was about 8 years old, she was doing her own little research on animals, and she noticed something very strange. Now, by now, the Valley of Hugran had a few people come in from the Empire. This is around the time also where the monarchs have already known about the Valley of Hugran, and they were getting very upset because they were sending envoys out there basically saying, you guys need to pay us, because you are using some of our resources on our land. And Volker and the rest of the people of the village basically agreed that, look, I get it, but, there are people starving in your empire right now that have nothing. We should be allowed to utilize land to live. We're not asking anyone for anything. We went into the most hostile area and made it successful. We built agriculture. We built a town here. It's just not fair for you to come back, and after you haven't been helping us, for us to have survived the way we did, for you to come and try to take that away from us. Volker was adamant about this, and of course, Yancey stood by him. So they were like, okay, you know what? Sucks to be you. It is still technically our land by deed. So either you come up with the money, that is the equivalent of about 90 crowns, to buy the land outright, or deuces. You either come back into the Empire, or you cease all that you're doing right now. Volker did not want to give up so easily. One particular day, Skyla came to her father and said, Dad, I found something in the forest. I caught it, and I need you to come look at it. So, of course, Volker loved his little girl. He liked her inquisitive mind, so he went to go see what she was talking about. And when he saw this, he was pretty taken aback. The Valley of Hugran had changed a lot. There were actually a lot of people who lived here, and they would utilize chemicals and all different kinds of things to basically terraform the area. As a result, new animal species were always coming in because of the new environment. Of course, they widened up the stream, which is now a river, a very flowing, abundant river that now had fish in it and all sorts of animals. So it was understandable that Volker and the others would see a great abundance and influx of creatures coming to the area. However, when Volker looked at this little creature that his daughter was showing him, he was completely perplexed. It was this little creature, and he studied it, and he said, that's strange. This creature is as small as a little finch. It has the face of a dog or an otter, and he was just like, what the heck? He observed the creature. The creature had 4 legs, 4 little nimble legs, but the legs at the front, the 2 legs at the front, had like these wispy appendages attached to them, and whenever the creature would flutter them, he caught one of them with like a little vice and gently moved it aside and splayed out these little protrusions, and he found out they were feathers. That's odd. This creature looks like a mammal. It has the ears of one as well, and yet it has feathers? How strange. Maybe it's some sort of bat that we've never seen before. As the creature grew, it became accustomed to humans. It would prance around on its 4 legs. Its 2 front legs still had those little wing-like appendages, and they were so cute. And the little girl, Skyla, actually fell in love with this creature. She said, you know what, Papa? This might be a fantasy creature. A creature that has parents that are from 2 different species. Volker thought about this, and he said, you know what? I didn't think about that. That is very strange. Remember, Volker is an inventor, so he made a whole bunch of stuff, and he was able to make machinery, although it took him many years to figure out what this creature was, and he would die never knowing. When Skyla became older, she figured it out, and she had continued to perfect what her father had started. Unfortunately, her brother Matt had long since died. Her parents passed away. Her brother had died when the monarchs had sent some of their soldiers to capture some of the people from the Valley of Hugran, and he died fighting them. When Skyla had done her research and looked at the creature, because the creature was no longer alive, but she did catch others like it. And when she had caught enough, she realized this is just not a fluke. This is an actual species. She was able to see the DNA of the creature and realized that the creature was indeed a mixture of some sort of canine and a bird, which was very odd because even in this world, she knew that birds and canines cannot breed with each other. These creatures were artificially made. Skyla had remembered that strange creature that they had seen that had looked like a dog mixed with a bat, and she wondered if the creature was also a result in artificial breeding. Unfortunately, Skyla would have to leave the Valley of Hugran. The Empire had pretty much taken over all of Kan Kalan, and so she couldn't stay in one place for very long. After a while, Skyla stopped by another town. It is in this town that she paired up with a man. It was a carpenter, and they had an attraction to each other, but they weren't in love. She ended up getting pregnant with a son. She and her son would move around from place to place because the Empire was coming after people, cracking down on people. On her back, Skylar always had some of these little creatures along with her, and she would breed them, selectively breed them. She remembered a dog that she and her family had a long time ago, and this dog had come from out of nowhere, and the father had remarked that the dog was very fox-like. The dog was a smaller dog, very fluffy, but had fox-like tendencies, and some of the phenotypical features were very fox-like. Now, they thought it was just coincidence, but Skyla feels as though that fox might have been another chimera. Her son would ask her, like, who is making all of these animals? If this is exactly what you think it is, and it's artificial breeding, who's responsible for releasing these species out into the wild? Skyla told her son that most likely it could have been an accident. Who knows? One particular morning, Skyla went out and she saw that one of the females of these creatures, she had since named the cannyfinch because it looked like a canine and a finch, she saw one of the creatures had given birth. Yes, these creatures usually laid eggs, but this particular one, there were no eggshells, and she figured maybe it's just a fluke. All the babies had died, unfortunately, and she thought this was kind of odd. The next female that she saw also gave live birth, but this time the babies lived. And what Skyla and her son realized was that the babies were changing. They were still a species, but something about the selective breeding had changed something, and it was causing these little animals, the cannifinches, to mutate. When she looked at this creature, it looked particularly different, and at first, Skyla thought that maybe the creatures were sick. But after several generations, the cannifinches started to look drastically different than how they looked before. Skyla was absolutely shocked by this, and her son was as well. He was like, Mom, what is going on? These creatures, now they just look totally different than how they started out. The creatures still had the canine face, but their ears had now little membranes on them, almost like fishtails, and their entire bodies were covered in these long, fluffy-like protrusions. They still had wings, but the wings on their forelegs were so small in comparison with the rest of the fluff on their bodies. The creatures also seemed smaller in size, and even though they were given a live birth, they seemed to mature a lot quicker than the ones that were in the eggs. Of course, because they were given more time to gestate. Many years passed by, and Skyla got older, and since then she had passed down all her research to her son, named Volker. He, of course, would keep moving around as his mother had said, but he would never give up researching the animals because he was fascinated by them. She told him before she had passed away that she didn't know how, but somehow the research, including these chimeras as they were being called, would be really essential to them becoming independent completely from the Empire. Volker would go on to marrying his wife. Eventually, they had kids. Volker and his wife had two boys, an older son and a younger. And just like their father, they absolutely loved animals. As the boys grew older, they learned the ways of their parents. They would see very strange things, like deer-like creatures who were blue all over, leaping above the grasslands. Strange hippo creatures with very long bodies and fur covering their upper torsos. And strange wolf-like creatures that had feathers covering their back, as though they were merged with some very ornate tropical bird. Not only would they run, but they would leap almost 15 feet in the air whenever running across a huge stretch of land. Over time, the older son Kay and the younger son Toby would study the cannifinches, who, after a few more generations, had become a completely separate species than the original cannyfinch. They were then called Harul Hummers. What was strange is that the males were 2 times larger than the original cannyfinch subsets, but the females were a size down. In the new town that Volker and his family set into, they were free from the empire. They were free from the hostility of the environment, which was wonderful. They could experiment at their leisure, and the only thing they had to do was get a license to breed all those animals. Volian would capture wild animals, aided by his two sons, who would then study them. And it was revealed that a lot of the animals around the end of the environment were indeed, as Skyla had said, chimeras. So far, from what they could see, the chimeras were pretty much harmless. And so Volian told his children, look, if we're going to be free from the Empire, because they are still trying to take down people resisting them, we're going to have to bump up the research and hurry. But time would catch up to them. Over time, Volian just became too old and sickly to continue his research and eventually passed away, leaving behind his wife and his two sons. Kay and Toby worked together on their father's research. As their mother became sicker, they would take care of her as well until she eventually passed away. It is amazing how in the space of about 30 years, how much could actually change. Harul hummers had once again become a completely separate species. The two long front legs that used to have wings on them were now obsolete, and their wings now made up a huge portion of the back of their little tiny bodies. They had little tiny antennae all around the upper portion of their bodies, which helped them to navigate. They spent most of their life in enclosures or environments to simulate being in the wild, and so they kind of evolved based on the environment that they were placed in. They also had become very intelligent, and a few of them would go out and escape. The two brothers, Toby and Kay, would fight with each other. There were times when Toby, while doing his research, would tell his brother that what he was doing was inefficient and that there was a better way to do it. But Kay, being the older brother, always felt as though Toby was trying to undermine him. And after they got in a really bad fight, Kay and Toby decided they were going to work separately. However, being a member of the town, Kay got into a lot of trouble. He got STDs, he got into fights, and he realized that living on the edge was more his speed. While he loved the idea of researching and learning about things, he feels like a lot of it was brought on by his parents, and that's not actually what he wanted to do. He and Toby basically cut ties. Kay just went off on his own. Toby decided to stay and to continue with the research. Toby continued his research, and he did have a few students that would help him with his work. He wanted them to go out there and study more of the animals and study more of the biology, as it was steadily changing. There were some invasive species that were happening as a result of this new chimera ecology. One such guy that he met, one of his students, was called Daniel, and he and Daniel basically fell in love with each other. Even when the students would go about their different jobs, Daniel would stay with Toby to help him with his research. And the new breeds of Harul hummers would go about their day, continuing to breed. And after a while, these are the creatures that we have seen inside of Daniel and Toby's research enclosure, their little sanctuary that they had for these creatures so they could study them. Residents would come and go out of the town. And so when Daniel and Toby heard this huge commotion, they didn't really think anything of it. But things just got louder and louder, and Toby basically told Daniel, hey, could you go check what's going on? So Daniel said sure. He got out of the shop and he made sure that he locked back up the other Harul hummers, and when he saw what was going throughout the village, Daniel was a bit perplexed. He didn't understand what he was looking at. He went back in and told Toby, hey, something is going on. I think we need to prepare to leave. Toby's like, we can't just up and leave our research. And Daniel told him, look, I just feel something is wrong. People are acting weird. I just don't think it's safe. So Toby told him, okay, babe, well, the best thing we can do right now is stay inside the store and not go out there. So Daniel was very nervous, and Toby realized how scared he was. And he's like, I know that he's not like this unless it's something serious. He went to the window to the outside, and what he saw shocked him. There were these strange creatures with very sharp beaks that were running on two legs around the village. And from a glance, it looked like they were huge ostriches with much shorter necks. But as he looked closer, he realized that these are creatures he's never seen before. They were half the size of a grown man. He ran surprisingly fast and had sharp claws, and had very fluffy but somewhat short tails hanging from the lower side of their bodies. The creature looked like a gigantic bird that was fluffy all over but minus wings. However, Daniel and Toby quickly gasped when they saw one of them open up what looked like wings from the side and took off. and a huge flock of them descended upon the village once more, taking a lot of people with them. The people were devastated, and when Daniel and Toby caught one of the creatures, a smaller version of them, and they studied it, they realized that these creatures were the Harulhummers, the descendants of the cannyfinch, the things that ended up getting away. There was a huge commotion in the back, and when Daniel went back to the enclosure to see what was happening, these large predatory descendants of the Harulhummers were killing all the Harulhummers that were inside of the enclosure. They were so strong and their beaks were so sharp that they were able to get in there no problem and just annihilate all of the species of Harulhummers. Daniel and Toby would tie up one of these creatures and try to help all those other people that needed help. After everything settled down and there was a board meeting and people were wondering if the Empire sent these creatures to come and kill them, because it seemed like a targeted attack, Danny and Toby had an idea. It was a story that they were going to have to use some of this research to defend the village. And he went to the board, Toby that is, and basically told the board members, hey, if this is a targeted attack, if these creatures were used by the Empire or whether or not they were, we can use them as a defense mechanism. Look how quickly they were able to dispatch so many of us. And everyone thought that Toby was insensitive, but Daniel backed him up and said, no, he's right. Listen to him. He knows what he's talking about. So after some time, Daniel and Toby employed more people to catch these creatures. And they were not able to tame them necessarily. These creatures were too wild. They were just way too aggressive. This is something that would work in their favor. But if Daniel and Toby didn't figure out a way to make these creatures less aggressive, they would be useless to them if they told them what to attack. So what Daniel and Toby decided to do was breed the creatures so that if the creatures bred, they would take the live birth young and raise them from hand. At first, the females would not let Daniel and Toby or any of the workers near them. And after a while of enough breedings, the females would get used to the humans and allow them to at least pick up their offspring, although the female had to be completely shut away from the humans to avoid them being killed. Their beaks were so razor sharp that one touch can split open skin in an instant. These things were good at filleting. Daniel gave the species name razorface, and when they did study their genealogy, they were in fact cannyfinches, or the descendants of cannyfinches. It is so astounding that this little creature, this tiny species that could fit into Toby and Daniel's hand, ended up giving rise to a creature that was 3.5 feet tall and could kill and drop a large human being at the drop of a hat within seconds. After some years, Toby and Daniel were able to get a more docile version of the razorface. These razorfaces were a lot more streamlined and less sturdy than the ones that came before. They were way less aggressive. They basically toned in the aggression and bred them in such a way that the aggression was geared towards protection. So if Daniel and Toby or anyone who these creatures knew were trying to protect those specific people, they would be aggressive towards whatever was hurting them. Toby and Daniel decided to try this out. There was an envoy that decided to come to the town. The monarchs had caught up with them, and of course they came in on their horses with their knives and swords and weapons. Daniel and Toby, in an attempt to protect the town, unleashed the cages with all of the razor faces inside them. These creatures, who used to be so small and adorable and used to be very tame and gentle, quickly lay waste to the threat. The razor faces used their powerful bird-like legs with very huge talons on the ends of them to skewer people, as well as their very long razor-like beak. They were not as strong flyers as their predecessors. However, they could aim their dive with accuracy. There were only about 30 of these creatures, and quite a bit of them ended up dying. Between these 30 creatures, they were able to dispatch 150 of the 200 soldiers that the Empire sent to the town. Toby did not like the fact that he had to kill to survive, but it's what he had to do, and he knew his father and grandparents would have been proud. Daniel stayed with him all throughout the way. After some time, the kingdom had to relent. They caught some of the creatures for themselves. They found them hard to take care of, and so this elicited a response from the kingdom and the monarchs that they had to build bigger and better weapons, which they did. However, there was a very unfortunate drawback to all of this. You see, Daniel and Toby were heroes. What they didn't know is that as a result of these creatures being tampered with, their DNA being tampered with, them being in close proximity with the researchers, they were able to pass down a horrible pathogen to the human race. And they didn't even have to really attack anyone. You just have to be in contact with them or close by them, and you got the sickness. And the sickness was debilitating. It caused blindness, it caused massive infections, but the infections really started in the eye. So people would go blind first, then they would go manic, and eventually they would die. They wouldn't be able to swallow or eat anything, and a bunch of humans died off. Unfortunately, Toby got this sickness, and the thing is that it takes about a month before you realize you have it. So as a result of him being in the same proximity as Daniel and them being intimate, they both got it and passed away. The monarchs weren't safe either. They just simply didn't have the manpower after a while to keep up with generating the weapons they needed to face off these birds, these weird, strange creatures that were killing them, not only physically, but also pathologically. Many people moved from the area, and as a result of the humans moving from the area and leaving this whole section, the razorfaces were free to breed in peace. They were no longer owned by humans, and they were able to breed with the original versions of themselves to make themselves a hardier species. After many years, the new town that Daniel and Toby and their family had settled in was completely reclaimed by nature. About 150 years have passed since the event of the taking down of the Empire. The town that they had settled in, where all this research had begun, where they had made these domestic aggressive versions of the razor faces, is almost unrecognizable. And so is the valley of Hugran, where the adventures of Volker had started, the inventor who started his line, who was responsible in his own way of taking down the empire, or producing the seed that would eventually. The razor faces looked like this 150 years ago, but they don't look like that now. After many years, the animals not only quickly breed, and they do so at such a rapid rate, but these creatures, because of how the environment is changing and because of them creating a more volatile environment, they look a lot different than they did a century or so ago. The razor faces are now half the size they were, coming in about 1.5 feet tall. Their wingspan is now much larger than that of their predecessors. They are mostly nocturnal, and they've lost since their long razor beak, instead opting for a beak that could crush open rocks or shells. They are still seen as birds or creatures of prey. Their specialty is scavenging. They have feathers, but they also have a strange fluffy coat that is covering almost the entire section of their body, making them appear much larger than they actually are. Over time, the area has also become cold and these creatures spread everywhere. There are humans still alive, but they've also had to adapt. Many of them are hanging on by a thread. The amount of humans in the region as these creatures had spread far and wide are about 70,000. What used to be the lovely kingdom is now in total ruin. This snowy barren region is now home to most of the razor faces, now called razor hawks. This female decided to go back to her nesting grounds, the valley of Hugran. It is where, when the babies are born, they will have enough food to hold them over until they reach maturity, which is about 6 months. Sometimes the most horrific things can be created based on the best intentions, and even still, beauty can still be found in them. As the female razor face looks around momentarily, as the cold air is hitting her feathers, she kind of beats out her wings, and then she flies up into the sky, heading towards her nesting grounds, ignoring all the other members of her species that are settling close by in the current biome. I wonder what their species will turn into thousands of years from now. That's the end of the story. Hope you guys enjoyed it. I'll see you later.